As the conflict between Ukraine and Russia enters a critical juncture, the dire implications of the ongoing war were thrust into the spotlight once again with a recent drone strike on the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has raised alarms over what he perceives as escalating Russian aggression, suggesting that President Vladimir Putin is preparing to target NATO countries in the coming year. This assertion comes as Zelensky engages in peace talks with U.S. officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance, amid a backdrop of heightened military tensions. On February 14, 2025, Zelensky reported that a Russian drone armed with a high-explosive warhead had struck a protective radiation shelter at Chernobyl's Reactor 4, resulting in significant damage and a fire that has since been extinguished. Fortunately, the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) reported no increase in radiation levels. Although the implications of such an attack on a site synonymous with nuclear disaster are profound, the Kremlin has denied responsibility for the incident, a claim that only adds to the complexity of the already fraught situation. During his remarks in Munich, where global officials are convening for security discussions, Zelensky emphasized the critical role of U.S. support for Ukraine's defense against Russian forces. "I think that Putin is preparing for war against NATO countries next year," Zelensky stated, underscoring the urgency of Western engagement in the region. His comments reflect a growing concern that the conflict could escalate beyond Ukraine's borders, potentially implicating NATO allies directly. As peace talks commence under the auspices of U.S. President Donald Trump, who recently announced the initiation of negotiations to resolve the Ukraine war, the dynamics shift further. Trump's administration has indicated a willingness to engage with Russia, raising fears in Kyiv about potential concessions that could undermine Ukraine's territorial integrity. Zelensky voiced his apprehensions, insisting that the U.S. must remain firmly on Ukraine's side and warning against any policy shifts that might favor Moscow. In the midst of these developments, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte highlighted the need for European allies to bolster their defense spending, recognizing that the current 2% GDP target may no longer suffice in the face of Russian threats. Rutte's remarks came as part of a broader call for NATO members to formulate concrete plans for Ukraine, emphasizing that a united front and increased military readiness are essential for regional stability. The geopolitical landscape is further complicated by reports of North Korea potentially sending additional troops to support Russian efforts in the ongoing conflict. Zelensky suggested that up to 3,000 North Korean soldiers could be deployed to the Kursk region, a move that underscores the global dimensions of the war and the alliances being formed in response to it. As military and diplomatic maneuvers unfold, the situation remains precarious. The IAEA has issued warnings regarding the persistent risks to Ukraine's nuclear facilities, particularly as military activities intensify around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The ongoing conflict has not only devastated the Ukrainian landscape but has also raised alarms about nuclear safety, adding another layer of urgency to peace discussions. Looking ahead, the question remains whether the diplomatic engagements initiated by the Trump administration can yield a viable resolution to the conflict. While many in Ukraine are weary from years of combat and may welcome a ceasefire, the terms of such an agreement will be critical. Any settlement that leaves Ukraine vulnerable to future aggression or territorial loss could further embolden Russia and destabilize the region. In conclusion, as the world watches the unfolding events in Ukraine, the interplay of military might and diplomatic negotiations will shape not only the future of Ukraine but also the security of Europe at large. The coming weeks and months may prove pivotal as the stakes are high and the potential for escalation looms ever larger. In a significant escalation of the ongoing conflict, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has raised alarms regarding Russia's aggressive posture, particularly in relation to NATO. During a press conference at the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky warned that Russian President Vladimir Putin may be preparing for military action against NATO countries as early as next year. "I think that he is preparing the war against NATO countries next year," Zelensky stated, underscoring the urgency of U.S. support for Ukraine in ongoing peace negotiations. This warning comes on the heels of a concerning incident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant where a Russian drone strike reportedly inflicted damage on a protective shelter surrounding the facility. Zelensky confirmed that a drone armed with a high-explosive warhead struck the new safe confinement structure, which was designed to contain radiation from the 1986 disaster. Fortunately, the fire caused by the attack has since been extinguished, and the International Atomic Energy Agency IAEA reported that radiation levels remain normal and stable. However, the incident has heightened fears of a nuclear disaster given the fraught backdrop of the conflict. The Kremlin has denied any involvement in the attack, further complicating the narrative surrounding this latest escalation in hostilities. Zelensky characterized the act as indicative of Russia's disregard for nuclear safety, stating, "The only country in the world that attacks such sites, occupies nuclear power plants, and wages war without any regard for the consequences is today's Russia." The IAEA has been on high alert with its personnel stationed at Chernobyl since the onset of Russia's invasion. The fallout from these developments has implications not just for Ukraine but for the broader geopolitical landscape. Discussions at the Munich conference have been dominated by calls for increased military support for Ukraine from NATO allies. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth emphasized the need for European nations to bolster their defense spending, suggesting that the current target of 2% of GDP is insufficient given the pressing threat posed by Russia. Hegseth's comments echo sentiments from NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, who urged European countries to devise concrete plans for Ukraine's future and to increase their military expenditures significantly. Moreover, Zelensky's remarks about potential Russian aggression towards NATO countries have prompted renewed discussions about Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership. The Ukrainian president firmly stated that there should be no compromises regarding Ukraine's position in the alliance, emphasizing the importance of U.S. support in countering Russian advances. As international discussions unfold, the situation remains dynamic. Zelensky also indicated that Russia could be bolstering its forces with additional North Korean troops, further complicating the security landscape. With tensions running high, the need for a cohesive response from NATO allies has never been more pressing. The ramifications of these events are likely to echo in the months to come as both sides of the conflict brace for a potentially intensified military engagement. The unfolding narrative of the Ukraine-Russia war continues to shape the geopolitical landscape, with the specter of nuclear safety risks and regional stability hanging in the balance. As the world watches closely, the crucial question remains: how will NATO respond to the evolving threats, and what role will Ukraine play in this increasingly complex geopolitical chess game, in a development that has sent shockwaves through geopolitical circles? President Vladimir Putin's recent phone call with President Donald Trump marks a significant turning point in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. This dialogue not only signifies a potential thaw in U.S.-Russia relations but also raises questions about the future of Ukraine and the broader European security landscape. On February 12, 2025, Trump and Putin engaged in what has been described as a lengthy and highly productive conversation where they outlined a vision for direct negotiations regarding Ukraine's fate. The timing of this call is particularly noteworthy, coming on the same day that Trump's newly appointed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth bluntly stated that the U.S. would not support Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership. This shift in rhetoric has been interpreted as an endorsement of Putin's long-standing demands, which include the cessation of Ukraine's NATO ambitions and the recognition of Russian sovereignty over occupied territories. Analysts are keenly observing how this call reshapes the narrative surrounding the conflict, especially considering the backdrop of 3 years of US-led efforts aimed at isolating Russia. Putin is playing a very clever game, noted Tatiana Stanovaya, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center in Berlin. She emphasized that Putin's strategy involves courting Trump as a potential ally in his quest to redefine Russia's standing in global politics. The impact of the call was immediately felt in Moscow, where state media celebrated what they viewed as a decisive victory for Putin. Commentators expressed glee at the apparent shift in the U.S. stance, with one lawmaker claiming that the call had broken the West's blockade against Russia. The Russian stock market surged by 5%. And the ruble strengthened against the dollar, signaling renewed optimism among Russian businesses that sanctions might soon be lifted. However, the optimism in Moscow is tempered by the reality of the battlefield. Reports indicate that Russian forces are suffering significant casualties, with estimates of around 1,000 a day. This grim statistic underscores the potential urgency for Putin to negotiate a peace deal that might allow him to scale back his military ambitions while securing some of his goals. Trump's approach, which emphasizes a desire for a swift end to hostilities, contrasts sharply with Putin's broader objectives. As the Kremlin seeks to limit NATO's influence and solidify its presence in Eastern Europe, the complexities of the negotiations ahead are becoming increasingly apparent. The U.S. has signaled a willingness to engage in discussions, but the key question remains: will Ukraine be allowed to participate in these talks? Or will decisions be made without its full input? The response from European leaders has been one of dismay at the rapid policy shift from Washington. John Healey, Britain's defense secretary, reiterated the stance that there can be no negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine, highlighting the concerns among European allies that they may be sidelined in a negotiation process that could reshape the continent's security architecture. Amidst this backdrop, the meeting of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky with U.S. officials in Munich will be critical. Zelensky aims to secure support and ensure that Ukraine's voice is not drowned out in the negotiations, as the stakes have never been higher. As the geopolitical landscape shifts, analysts caution that while Putin may feel emboldened by recent developments, the situation remains fluid. The potential for a negotiated settlement exists, but it is fraught with challenges, particularly in light of the heavy toll the war has taken on both sides. The implications of this call extend beyond Ukraine, as it may redefine U.S.-Russia relations and alter the dynamics of global power. In conclusion, the phone call between Trump and Putin represents a pivotal moment in a protracted conflict that has already claimed countless lives and reshaped alliances. The coming weeks will be crucial in determining whether this dialogue leads to a genuine peace process or merely serves as a prelude to further hostilities. As both sides grapple with their ambitions and the realities on the ground, the world watches closely, hoping for a resolution that prioritizes stability and security in Europe. In a significant shift in international relations, the recent call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin has sent shockwaves throughout Europe and Ukraine. Russian officials and state media greeted the news with enthusiasm, viewing Trump's potential meeting with Putin as a pivotal moment in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has persisted for nearly 3 years. This shift comes at a time when Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has firmly reiterated that any negotiations concerning Ukraine must include his country, signaling a potential fracture in diplomatic approaches and alliances. Trump's announcement marks a stark departure from 3 years of U.S. foreign policy that had largely sidelined Putin in favor of supporting Ukraine. The president's new stance appears to elevate Putin as the primary figure in peace negotiations, sidelining not only Zelensky but also key European stakeholders. Ukrainian President Zelensky expressed his concerns, labeling the prospect of negotiating without Ukraine's participation as very dangerous, emphasizing, "We cannot accept it as an independent country, any agreements made without us." This change in the U.S. approach has raised alarms across Europe, where leaders are increasingly wary of Trump's intentions. The European Union and NATO members, who have been steadfast in their support for Ukraine, are now grappling with the implications of a U.S. policy that may align more closely with Moscow's vision for the end of the conflict. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and EU Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas have both articulated the necessity for European involvement in any discussions about Ukraine's future, stating that any deal behind our backs will not work. The reaction in Russia has been one of jubilation. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov conveyed that the current U.S. administration's stance is much more appealing, while senior Russian officials framed the call as a historic moment in diplomacy. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chair of Russia's National Security Council, stated that the conversation between the two presidents is significant in itself, highlighting the importance of U.S.-Russia dialogue. Russian media outlets echoed these sentiments, suggesting that Trump's overtures have undermined Ukraine's position and power on the global stage. Zelensky's apprehension is compounded by the realization that Trump's policy may effectively hinder Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership and the recovery of territories lost to Russian aggression. Trump has repeatedly suggested that Ukraine's NATO ambitions were a catalyst for the conflict, asserting that it is unrealistic to expect Russia to accept Ukraine's NATO membership. This stance has left European leaders and NATO allies in a state of confusion, questioning how they can maintain the post-World War II security architecture that has long been threatened by Russian advances. As discussions unfold, Zelensky remains committed to ensuring Ukraine's voice is central to any negotiations. He has expressed his determination to prevent the situation from falling under Putin's control, stating that it is crucial for Ukraine to assert its independence in the dialogue. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has reiterated the need for Ukraine's involvement, emphasizing that negotiations without Ukrainian input would not be legitimate. In the coming days, Vice President J.D. Vance is set to lead a U.S. delegation at the Munich Security Conference, where discussions about Ukraine's future will take center stage. Vance is expected to meet with Zelensky, providing an opportunity for U.S. officials to clarify their positions on the ongoing conflict and the role of Ukraine in any potential peace talks. As the geopolitical landscape continues to evolve, the stakes remain high for Ukraine, Europe, and the global community. The implications of this pivot in U.S. foreign policy could reshape the dynamics of international relations in Europe and beyond. As tensions remain palpable, the future of Ukraine hangs in the balance, and the world watches closely as leaders navigate this critical juncture. With the specter of Russian aggression looming, the necessity for robust diplomatic engagement and strategic alliances has never been more pressing, underscoring a critical moment in the ongoing saga of the Ukraine conflict.